Good afternoon from nighttime Berlin. Thank you very much, dear Stephanos, dear Markus, for your introduction. Thank you, Markus, for translating my lecture text. It is an extraordinary honor for us to present our book to you, to the students and faculty of the prestigious University of Notre Dame, but also to all the other participants from the United States and elsewhere. The book Urban Planning in Nazi Germany is, we think, far more than only a book about history of urban planning. It is also a message. Exactly 1 year ago, our book was published. Since then, it has received widespread acclaim, and we, the editors, have presented it in many different cities. The book Urban Planning in Nazi Germany was the result of long-term research into urban planning and dictatorships in Europe, which began in 1999. The project resulted in a series of books on urban planning of different dictatorships. Although these books were compiled by a group of authors, they are not anthologies. Each is a monograph. This book on Nazi Germany concludes the series. It is the only volume in the series to be published in both German and English. This was important to us because we wanted to put out research findings up for discussion beyond the German-speaking world. A specific feature of our group of editors is that it comprises individuals of different generations and disciplines, from doctoral and postdoctoral candidates to professors and professors emeriti, and from the fields of political science, social science, art history, architecture, and urban studies. One editor is originally from Chile, one co-author originally from Italy. According to the initial thesis of our book, urban planning was a key instrument for the dictatorship. No other field made the Nazi power as legible as urban planning did. Urban planning reshaped cities and landscapes in ways that were visible to all. It effectively created the so-called Lebensraum for the racially defined Volksgemeinschaft of the German nation. But it also opened spaces for violence against political opponents, Jews, Polish people, Soviet citizens, and other marginalized groups. Above all, urban planning contributed substantially to the preparation, conduct, and persistence of large-scale criminal warfare. But what really is urban planning? The German term Städtebau is nearly untranslatable. Unlike urbanism, urban design, urban planning, urban development, the German word Städtebau actually encompasses various meanings. It is a formal product, a social process, a material object to be analyzed, an academic discipline, a practice-oriented profession, and a material process. The German term Städtebau reflects controversies that arise between the professions of architecture and spatial planning, for example, but also within these professions. The constantly changing understanding of the term is itself both mirror and testimony to the history of the profession or sub-professions, which also includes spatial planning, landscape architecture, and civil engineering, and increasingly the economic, social, environmental, and historical sciences too. The fine arts must also be mentioned here, as artistic decoration in the form of statues, murals, or mosaics, for example, was often an important part of the urban planning program. In the English version of our book, we mostly use the term urban planning, but occasionally also urban development or urban design, depending on context. However, Nazi urban planning was neither rigid nor based on a single master plan. Instead, it underwent constant changes and proved to be extremely flexible. Consequently, the focus of urban planning shifted continuously, as did the cities and landscapes that received special attention and the influential individuals and institutions involved. We suggest that the 12 years of Nazi dictatorships in Germany can be divided into 3 periods: attack, triumph, and terror. Neither 1937 nor 1941 were years of total upheaval in terms of urban development, of course. Despite the necessary restrictions, these years were qualitative turning points in time, according to the results of our research. During the 12 years of dictatorship, the scope of Nazi urban planning expanded repeatedly. Initially, it was limited to Germany. In 1933, to the east of Germany, there were still Poland and Czechoslovakia, and Austria to the south, all states that would cease to exist a few years later. By 1940, Nazi Germany had occupied France, and by 1941, Greece. In 1941, Yugoslavia was also occupied and divided. In the summer of 1941, the German Wehrmacht marched into the Soviet Union. Nazi Germany occupied the Baltic Soviet republics, the Belarusian and Ukrainian Soviet republics, and parts of the Russian Soviet Republic. Within a few years, the political situation in Europe had changed dramatically. The constantly expanding occupied territories were of great importance for Nazi urban planning, serving as areas to be planned and dominated by infrastructural projects, as well as places to exploit natural resources and, above all, human labor. Important for the Nazis' seizure of power was not only Hitler's participation in the government of the German Reich in January 1933. What was decisive was how the Nazis immediately used this participation to consolidate their rule through exclusion and violence, but above all through permanent mass mobilization. The usurpation of May 1, 1933 was of extraordinary significance. On this day, and through an enormous mass event, they succeeded in turning a former day dedicated to the fight of the labor movement into a day for the Nazi movement. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, triumphantly noted in his diary on May 1, 1933, quote, "There is an indescribable throng of people on Tempelhofer Feld. At around 7 p.m., the news comes that 1.5 million people have marched here. A great frenzy of enthusiasm has gripped the people." The stage, which was built specifically for this purpose and can be seen here, was designed by the young and until then a largely unknown architect Albert Speer. Just one day later, the trade unions in Germany were eliminated and later forcibly incorporated in the newly founded German Labor Front. On May 3, 1933, Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary, "We are the masters of Germany." May 1, 1933 can be considered as a key event in securing the Nazi dictatorship. The Nazi mass mobilization was not limited to May 1. Its strategic goal was the creation of a racially defined Volksgemeinschaft, an idea of a national community based on racism. To that end, many schools had to be built and converted for children and young people and for all kinds of professional groups to further the education of new elites of state and party. In the existing schools, not only Jewish, but all kinds of politically disliked teachers were removed. Here you can see one of the three schools of the Nazi Party that were actually built between 1935 and 1936. The Ordensburg Sonthofen in the Alpine foothills, a monastery-like castle intended to shape and educate the future party elite. Of fundamental importance were also the countless labor camps of the Reich Labor Service, which were set up throughout the country. They served to inspire the German youth for the Nazi movement and to prepare them in an almost playful manner for a future war. In the picture you can see clearly the spatial structure of such a camp. The entrance gate was always particularly striking. The slogan above the gate read, "We are building Germany." Incidentally, this picture can be seen on the cover on the German edition of the book. Behind the gate is a large open space surrounded by barracks. The open space is usually landscaped. Countless Reich Labor Service camps were constructed in this way, creating a landscape of camps in Germany. These camps of the early years of dictatorships were not for prisoners, but for the National Socialist education of German youth. The large-scale facilities built for Nazi Party rallies in Nuremberg and Reich Harvest festivals on the Bückeberg were well known and had an extraordinary impact. The Nuremberg rally sites were the largest urban design project planned during the Nazi era, but only few of them were actually built. The facilities on the Bückeberg, which were primarily used to mobilize farmers, are far less well known today. Some 500,000 people are said to have participated in the first harvest Thanksgiving festival in October 1933. Over the first period of Nazi dictatorship, urban development programs aimed at modernization were widely publicized. Secretly, however, urban planning served for rearmament projects. Modernizing the German city required the renewal of old city centers and the development of suburban areas. Primarily, these measures continued the housing policy of the Weimar Republic, retaining non-profit housing associations and rent controls. At the same time, however, the housing associations were now brought under Nazi control, and the target groups of new housing policy were, in the regime's own words, racially valuable, healthy, and hereditarily healthy settler families. New housing was created above all for workers employed in the armaments sector. As can be seen here, suburban settlements were built in response to the overcrowding and perceived inadequacies of large cities. This distinguished the German dictatorship from those in the Soviet Union and Italy, where high-rise apartment buildings were the primary construction type. The development and beautification of the German landscape was promoted through highway construction and the development of holiday resorts. The largest project was the construction of the German Autobahn. By the end of 1937, 2,000 kilometers of motorway had already been completed. A civil engineer, Fritz Todt, was responsible for this infrastructural mega project. The Nazi armament policy also required a program for building barracks facilities. Between 1935 and 1938, 532 new barracks were built. But barrack is not strictly the right term. What emerged were small barrack towns. While the new buildings were generally standardized, their urban layout varied greatly. Some were designed by renowned architects. The planned complex you can see here is largely symmetrical, with an onion dome marking the entrance. A large square rigidly enclosed by rows of trees lies behind the central building. However, according to the British historian Adam Tooze, the most dramatic industrial innovation of the Third Reich was the creation of an aircraft industry. In 1933, this industry was still insignificant. By the early 1940s, it had become a multi-billion-dollar industry. This largest manufacturing industry in Germany was not only entirely state-controlled, but also the result of a state initiative, financed and directed exclusively by the state. This institution was known as the Reich Aviation Ministry. The expansion of the Luftwaffe, the Air Force industry, was accompanied by the construction of aircraft factories, airfields, barracks, schools, academies, research facilities, factory settlements, and camps. The picture shows an important research facility in Berlin, an example of modern architecture. Between 1933 and 1939, around 200 air bases and flight schools were established. The Reich Aviation Ministry became the most important player in urban development in the early years of the dictatorship. And what about power projecting urban design? This element of the discipline only slowly made this way into the spotlight in propaganda, but remained rather modest in practice. Munich was initially the most important city in this regard. Several new buildings were constructed around the Königsplatz, and this project was frequently presented in propaganda as a model. The second major complex was built in Weimar. Here, Adolf Hitler Square, also known as the Gau Forum, was intended to create a new city center. The Gau Forum was largely realized. However, the command buildings of the Wehrmacht, especially those of the Luftwaffe, were much more in the center of attention. These buildings were highly visible in many cities due to their monumentality. This was particularly evident in the largest government complex of the German Reich during the initial period, the Reich Aviation Ministry in Berlin. At an international level, the main challenge was to catch up with the other dictatorships. Around 1933, plans for a monumental redesign of the capital were already well underway in Stalin's Soviet Union and Mussolini's Italy. Above all, the National Socialists sought to surpass the role model Italy. Their first attempt, the Reichssportfields in Berlin, fell short in terms of urban design compared to the Forum Mussolini in Rome, which was carefully integrated into the landscape and surrounding urban context via numerous axes. The Nazis' attempt to draw a parallel between the drainage of the Pontine Marshes southeast of Rome, a project that was also admired in democratic countries abroad, and the modest inner colonization project in Schleswig-Holstein in northern Germany was rather embarrassing. In almost all areas of urban development during this period, the German dictatorship fell short of its counterparts in Italy and the Soviet Union. Around 1937, as the dictatorship stabilized, the priorities changed. The large facilities for mass mobilization in Nuremberg and on the Bückeberg were taken out of service. Power projecting urban planning became the main focus, or so it seemed. This shift was supported by a so-called redesign law. This law was intended to facilitate the representative redesign of selected cities, for example, through expropriation. A previously unknown urban design fever, fueled in 1939-1940 by the euphoria of rapid victories in Poland and France, now seized not only Hitler, but all the powerful and many regional small Führers on the Reich as well. Redesign plans were drafted throughout the country by the new Reich authorities in Berlin and Munich, as well as by numerous regional leaders. Even ambitious municipalities joined in. Berlin, not Munich, was by now the nation's most important city. At the same time, propaganda and urban planning was centralized and geared towards these plans. Special attention in the official propaganda was dedicated to the planned new center of Berlin. This center was to unfold along a representative grand boulevard. Its highlight was a 320-meter-high gigantic structure of the Great Hall, seen in the image above. Especially noteworthy was also the planned monumental 117-meter-high triumphal arch. Incidentally, no other dictatorship planned an entirely new capital city center outside the old center. This was specific only to Berlin. Albert Speer was tasked with the urban planning in Berlin as a general building director for the capital of the Reich. In Munich, Hermann Giesler, the general building director of the so-called capital of the movement, also planned a new monumental center west of the old center. It was to be crowned by an approximately 200-meter-high monument to the Nazi Party. Albert Speer and Hermann Giesler were not simply architects, they were Reich authorities with substantial financial and human resources, and they were superior to the municipal authorities. At this point, the international competition among the hegemonic dictatorships was primarily fought out through drawings and models, with grandiose plans to redesign the centers of capital cities, and above all with the design of a huge dominant central building. In response to the planned Palace of the Soviets in Moscow and the Palazzo del Littorio in Rome, Albert Speer designed the Great Hall in Berlin. The World's Fair in Paris in 1937 marked the beginning of this intensifying competition among the major dictatorships. There, the exhibition buildings of the three dictatorships competed against each other. The chief architects of the three exhibition buildings were the leading architects of the dictatorships: Boris Joffman for the Soviet Union, Marcello Piacentini for Italy, and Albert Speer for Germany. It was the evidence of triumphant urban development in Paris, and above all in the capitals of the three major dictatorships, Moscow, Rome, and Berlin, that became engraved in the collective memory as typical of dictatorships, even in the perception of many experts. However, this is a very simplistic view, a remarkably abbreviated perception, one that was and remains strongly shaped by the propaganda of the dictatorship. In the shadow of the monumental paper projects, rearmament was pushed forwards in Germany through the construction of new large industrial plants. One example of this is the new Telefunken factory in Berlin, designed by the well-known industrial architect Hans Hertlein. The new factory was not simply a building, but an extensive complex with a large green court of honor and a 9-story clock tower. But it were not only large industrial plants that were built, but also entirely new industrial cities. Thus, 2 new cities were planned in central Germany around the 2 giant industrial complexes. The city of the KdF car, the Volkswagen city, today Wolfsburg, and nearby the city of the Hermann Göring works, today Salzgitter. Unmistakably, however, in the realization of these new industrial cities, the sequence was reversed. First, the factories were built, and only then housing, both in settlements and in camps. The grandiose representative centers of the KdF city and the Hermann Göring city, which you can see here in the picture, were never built. Important too was the construction of many small plants in Germany's forests and the expansion of Wehrmacht centers. The new armament plants required new housing, new settlements for German workers, and increasingly camps for workers from all over Europe. Workers who were initially lured to Germany, but later brought there by force. One example of the munitions plant in the German forests was Föhringkamp, south of Munich. A completely new small town emerged there. The large facilities for mass mobilization were now followed on a much larger scale than before the facilities for exclusion, the concentration camps. From 1936 onwards, the urban forms of the concentration camps that are still in the center of our collective memory today began to take shape. The Sachsenhausen camp was planned for a total of around 6,000 prisoners. The semicircular layout starting from the watchtower above the camp gate allowed the prisoners to be guarded as in a panopticon-type prison building. However, the use of the triangle as a large urban planning form combining different spatial programs proved unsuitable and was no longer relevant in later construction phases. More compact camp architectures, mostly in the form of comb-shaped barrack complexes, proved more functional. Far less present in our memory are the large-scale projects undertaken in preparation for war. In the western part of Germany, Fritz Todt organized the massive undertaking of constructing the Westwall or Siegfried Line. Contrary to the notion of a wall, the western fortification was not a completely closed defensive line, but rather a patchwork of different construction sections and projects, some of which reflected different defense strategies and were adapted to specific regional conditions. For military reasons, the aim was to blend in with the landscape. On September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. The first Polish city to be largely destroyed was Wilun. Plans were soon drawn up for how this city should be rebuilt as a German city. Throughout occupied Poland, German colonial urban planning now began, premised on the plundering on the country and the displacement of the local population. This is where Heinrich Himmler gained influence and where spatial planning rose to become a new important planning profession. The diagram shows the distribution of new German settlements and how they are connected with one another. It is intended to illustrate the principles for the organization of settlement in the East. The invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 changed priorities once again. Because the expected Blitzkrieg and Blitzsieg did not materialize, the Nazi leadership postponed the major projects to redesign German cities until after the so-called Endsieg, the final victory. This marked the beginning of the most terrorist period of urban planning. Plans for the violent Germanization of the conquered eastern territories in Poland and the occupied territories of the Soviet Union intensified in parallel with the murderous practices of the SS in the new extermination camps. Auschwitz stands for this development like no other site in Europe. Here you can see a development plan for the city from 1942. Auschwitz was not only the site of extermination camps, a large industrial plan and an extensive residential town were also planned there. The war also required new infrastructure. The Atlantic Wall in the west, makeshift roads and bridges in the east. For both projects, an efficient organization stood in place, the Todt organization headed by Fritz Todt. The Atlantic Wall was undoubtedly the largest construction project of the Nazi dictatorship. It was nearly 2,700 kilometers long and was intended to protect the west coast of mainland Europe. However, the term wall is somewhat misleading. The Atlantic Wall consisted of fortified command posts of different kinds, primarily more than 8,000 bunkers. There were also huge U-boat pens for naval warfare. The construction of the Atlantic Wall was decided in the winter of 1941-42, the same winter in which Germany declared war on the United States. At that time, a new Europe under Nazi rule seemed to be taking shape. From the Nazis' perspective, this was a Europe no longer dominated and led by England, but by Germany. This dominance was to be secured by major transport infrastructure projects, motorways and waterways. However, the turning point of the war in Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-1943 shifted urban planning practices once again. In the German Reich, but also in the occupied territories, forced labor camps were now being built en masse. The workers interned there had to work primarily for the constantly expanding German arms industry, above all for the aircraft industry, because German workers had to fight at the front. The bombs dropped by Allied aircraft forced the construction of bunkers and temporary shelters in Germany. But above all, they necessitated the construction of new underground armament facilities for the production of aircraft. These facilities were intended to protect aircraft production from Allied attacks. Here you can see the construction of such facility west of Munich. The plan was to build a 5-story aircraft production hall beneath a 400-meter long, 83-meter wide, and 25-meter high concrete structure. They were built in great haste under extremely dangerous conditions. Thousands of forced laborers died during the construction. During this period, the Nazi leadership lost the initiative in urban planning. The establishment of camps for forced labor from all over Europe, the construction of emergency shelters, the creation of underground factories, and even the Atlantic Wall were unforeseen and forced, yet again efficient responses to the failure to achieve a rapid victory in the Soviet Union. In the final months of the war, reconstruction was discussed systematically for the first time. The plans were for 8 air raid-proof buildings divided into cells with space for cars and with no consideration for new monumental urban centers. The essential urban planning principles presented as new after 1945 had already emerged in the final months of the Nazi dictatorship. From an international perspective, the final period was characterized by the large-scale plundering of resources and people to serve the German arms industry. Urban planning historians have largely ignored this third period for a long time until now. Urban planning programs and activities never manifested as a unified concept or as the concept of a single leader. Instead, they emerged from a complex network of various organizations and their leaders, characterized by frequently changing relationships of rivalry and cooperation. This also applied to professional associations of architects, civil engineers, and urban planners, most of which quickly and voluntarily excluded their Jewish members. Through conformity, anticipatory obedience, personal coordinations, so-called Gleichschaltung, and electing party members as their leaders, the professional associations, including the universities, opened themselves to National Socialism. At the same time, entirely new professional organizations were created, displacing existing ones. During the initial period, alongside the adapted and steered ministries inherited from the previous regime, entirely new actors of urban planning emerged. These included the newly created Reich Aviation Ministry, which was responsible for civil and military aviation facilities. Other institutions and leaders gained authority, such as the German Labour Front under Robert Ley. The German Labour Front asserted responsibility for settlement construction, building elite educational institutions, and constructing leisure facilities. Then there was Fritz Todd's authority, which drove highway construction and the Organisation Todd. Finally, there was the Reich Labor Service under Konstantin Hill, which was responsible for constructing countless Reich Labor Service camps. During the second period, the influence of Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, who was responsible for the concentration camp system, became even more powerful. The appointment of Albert Speer as the general building inspector for the Reich capital was significant. Spain's appointment was a new Reich authority, as was Hermann Giesler's appointment as the new German building officer for the capital of the movement, Munich. Additionally, there were many Gauleiters with plans for their respective Gau capitals. Fritz Todd headed the Todd organization, which built the Siegfried Line. In the third period, Heinrich Himmler significantly expanded his spheres of influence as Reich Commissioner for the Consolidation of German Ethnicity, and was primarily responsible for the so-called Germanization of the East. The Todd organization now built the Atlantic Wall and organized the underground relocation of the war-critical Air Force industry. Throughout all these periods, Hermann Göring was the most important urban planning politician in the Nazi leadership. As Reich Minister of Aviation, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, and Commissioner for the 4-year plan. In terms of the results achieved, he was certainly more significant than Adolf Hitler. And Göring was responsible too for the mass destruction of European cities, the most negative urban development in European history. Fritz Todd, not Albert Speer, proved to be the most important urban planner of the Nazi era. Albert Speer produced many drawings and models. Fritz Todd organized the construction of the Autobahn, the West Wall, the Atlantic Wall, and the war infrastructure. However, Todd died in a plane crash in 1942 under circumstances that remain unclear. Albert Speer then took over all of his many offices. This certainly contributed to the fact that Todd's key role in Nazi urban planning has largely been forgotten. But what is typically dictatorial in the so described urban planning, and what is typical of urban planning under the Nazi dictatorship? Basic forms such as monumental buildings, traditional architecture, classicist architecture, the dominance of public buildings in urban spaces, cityscape care, the construction of educational institutions, and the creation of camps are not dictatorial per se. The claim that an architect builds in a fascist style because he uses columns and symmetries, considers axes and strives for monumentality is a tantamount to trivializing dictatorships. The dictatorial nature of Nazi urban planning was less inherent in the style, less in its basic form of axes or columns, but much rather in the political circumstances of planning and building, in the racist exclusion policies and the socio-political goals of the dictatorship, in the establishment of omnipotent building authorities and the elimination of municipal autonomy, in the way experts are organized and influenced by the media. The dictatorial nature was also expressed in the use of forced labor and in the way buildings and facilities were used. Even the camp is not per se a place of terror, although structural features such as fences, Forced labor and killing facilities also shaped the design of the dictatorial forced labor camp. The dictatorial is therefore also found in the structural features of the basic form, but not in the basic form itself. Such a view also attributes a value of its own to the design of an urban development product, which is not simply determined by political circumstances. And it does not rule out of the possibility of dictatorial urban planning products having design quality per se. Before I close, I would like to address 4 central theses. It should not be forgotten that everything I have reported here is only a very small excerpt of what we have presented in the book in text and images. Yes, the images are also very important. They often focus the design details of Nazi urban planning that I have only been able to hint at here. Nazi urban planning was constantly changing, with the early years differing fundamentally from the later years. Public opinion primarily associates the Nazi dictatorship with the Holocaust, which characterized the final period. Expert opinion, however, focus on the second period, when power-projecting projects for Berlin and Munich were designed but never implemented. Preparing for and conducting the war was a top priority and continues to receive little attention. Hardly anyone is familiar with the dictatorship's most important building, the wooden barracks. Similarly, few people are familiar with the most significant urban planning project, the camp, not only the concentration camp. A distinctive feature of Nazi urban planning throughout the 12 years of dictatorship was its focus on preparing for and executing war, unlike other major dictatorships. Unlike the repeatedly displayed designs for urban planning, the military-related projects are largely carried out from 1933 until the end of the war with changing fields of action. Nazi urban planning was developed in an international context. It was not solely of national in character. It was influenced by other countries and in turn influenced them. The relationship between the 3 major dictatorships, Fascist Italy, the Soviet Union, and Nazi Germany, was of considerable importance in urban planning. Attention must also be paid to the growing spaces of urban planning, with the expansion of controlled territory beyond Germany's 1933 borders. New areas such as Austria, Poland, Western France, Belarus, and Ukraine increasingly became the focus of urban development. Ultimately, the unique system of forced labor was European in scope. In the fall of 1945, the number of forced laborers reached a peak of 7.9 million. More than 20 million persons were forced laborers for Germany during the World War II in occupied Europe and the German Reich. This increase was linked to a massive urban development program involving the construction of forced labor camps. Around 30,000 such camps were built in total. Under National Socialism, Germany was a landscape primarily of camps. After 1933, it was a landscape of Reich labor service integration camps. After 1941, it was a landscape of forced labor camps, prisoner of war camps, and concentration camps. The most important building block of these camps was the wooden barrack. Propaganda shaped and shapes the understanding of Nazi urban planning. Urban planning in the 20th century always involved propaganda, the promise of a better city, demonstrating one's greatness and glorifying the past. In other words, Germany above all in the world, as the first 2 lines of the national anthem at the time put it. In this respect, propaganda is and has been a social reality with an impact. This must be taken seriously and examined as part of urban development. The instruments of this propaganda were diverse and included photos, films, models, drawings, plans, and artworks. Dictatorships took such propaganda to extremes, to the point where propaganda overshadowed urban planning practices and began to replace them. Propaganda increasingly became a central instrument of competition between the dictatorships. After 1945, the professionals fell into an eloquent silence. After 1945, German experts were largely speechless. How could the past 12 years of urban planning be put into words? How should they describe their own role? How could the end of the dictatorship be explained? A very simple and misleading consensus soon emerged. This consensus was Nazi architecture consisted of large monumental buildings, most of which were never actually built. And further, the Nazi architects involved in this field were Albert Speer and Hermann Giesler. And further, Nazi architectural style was a primitive classicism. That all fell short. Much remained in the dark for many years, until the student movement around 1968. Some topics were only discovered by the general public after 2000, such as the widespread phenomenon of forced labor camps. Another example is the significance of modern architecture for buildings used for rearmament. The silence of the post-war years, which lasted decades, created a unique German form of remembrance, particularly the suppression of crucial aspects of urban development. We are still working to overcome this type of memory today. It is not just a matter of identifying a few guilty figures, but rather understanding how and why the Nazi dictatorship arose and consolidated its power for so long. It is also important to understand why it could only be overthrown from outside, not from within. What contribution did our professions make to this? Urban planners, architects, civil engineers, landscape architects, artists, universities, and professional associations all played a role. Without these experts' contributions, this cruel and destructive dictatorship and the criminal war would never have been possible. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for this outstandingly dense and deep lecture. And I must say, every time I hear it in this full broadness, I'm astounded how complex, how differentiated this phase of history was, and how our profession was intertwined to this terrible phase. One thing I think that was really important for us to see that the architecture and the urban planning at this time was not mainly focused on classicism or neoclassicism, as you call it, primitive classicism, and the grand projects that always come to mind, but that it was a very broad building project that also was did a major contribution also to industry and housing, especially the social housing question would be the question I would like to pose before I hand over to the auditorium, and maybe Christian can tell us a little more about this special topic, especially because we will be focusing on social housing in our next Anta magazine. May we imagine that the social housing program in National Socialism was equally diverse in styles and, also in scales?
Yeah, I think the housing policy adopted by Nazi Germany was that of the Weimar Republic, and the program was small suburban housing settlements and social housing project for the unemployed that were built in the first years, often through self-initiatives. With the rise of the German Labour Front, the so-called homestead settlements and large community housing projects were established. Often rows of uniform houses were built along curved streets. The architecture sometimes featured elements considered typical for the region, such as brick buildings with stepped gables or half-timbered houses. There's a variation of types of settlements, but primarily housing construction later was built for the arms industry, the expanded arms industry, and for new factories that were built, and these settlements or factory towns accelerated.
So I would like to open up the to the auditorium for questions. We would like to ask that you come up front so our guests in Berlin can see and hear you.
There is a question, right?
So would you read it to the audience?
This question comes from Philip, and he says, the monuments around the world helped shape the collective memory of World War II in many societies. Is there a collective memory of all these planned Nazi monuments that were never built, part of the collective memory in Germany? Or is your project helping to build this collective memory? I believe that's for Harald.
Just send it. It's the top one, right?
So it's a little hard for us to understand you correctly. Just to be sure, the question is about if there is a collective memory in Europe about Nazi architecture, urban planning, or if our book consolidates a new understanding of this collective memory, right?
No, I think this question more addresses the unbuilt architecture, so that the architectures that have stayed paper. If there is a collective memory to the paper architecture of that phase.
So no, I wouldn't say that, no, because what we're trying to state with the book is that it's really important when we talk about urban planning is that we talk about the drawn plans and also about the realized plans. And the thing about the unrealized plans is that they are not part of a collective memory. For a lot of cities, also the local citizens don't really know what was planned for the cities. Also, when we talk about newer generations, for example, who didn't really have any background with the time of occupation, for example, in various countries, this memory or this part of occupation, for example, was just erased from the collective memory for large parts, or was just re-narrated. So especially unrealized plans don't have a place in that. And what we're stating with the book is that it is really important to talk about that, because it just forms the whole picture of what a dictatorship really means, what the Germans were trying to build up in Europe, or what the new Europe was trying to be, or was designed to be. So yeah, that's a large step we have to take in the upcoming years to really focus on what is not yet a part of a memory and cannot be memorized if we don't have anything we can see and touch. Yeah. Anybody wants to add to that?
Maybe the basis of our work is not what we can find in other books about architects or spectacular projects. We began 1933 and studied each year, each period until 1945, and this is the basis. And so we came to an interpretation of this whole time, and it's not possible to stay in between the limits of this very known designs to projects, and it's very necessary to not to accept the limits of the single disciplines. In our book we could integrate, for instance, landscape architecture, economy, some military aspects, and not only this. At the same time, we had to observe the propaganda. Propaganda was not only the expression of non-existent things. Propaganda was in a very effective way combined with projects, and therefore we say propaganda was another field of the competition between the dictatorships. But this propaganda was the propaganda in the context of urbanism and architecture was very important to convince the population, and this was not only an abstract discourse. It was very often related to important projects and not only spectacular projects.
There's another online question, unless someone from the audience would like to come to the podium. I will read this. This is from Patrick Leach, and he is from the University of Bologna. And he says, thank you very much for a hugely interesting lecture. You mentioned industrial building for Telefunken and Volkswagen production centers. I imagine these were private industries. Could you please say something about the collaboration between public planning and private industrial development during this period?
That's hard to answer, actually. That's part of private companies' history also, that a lot of companies haven't really worked on, and that wasn't our main focus. So I can only answer that like in a more general way. There are particularly private industries really literally profited from the dictatorship, and building companies, but also like different companies like Krupp, for example, they really were a big part of the industry of the dictatorship. And for example, Krupp built the German pavilion for the World Fair, for the World Exhibition in 1937. And there are huge brochures where they really promote their company with that project, for example. Other companies like Hochtief, for example, a big construction industry. My mother is actually working there. They haven't really figured out what their history was, but there's also a lot of marketing. You can see where they promote also project that they built, that they participated in the highway construction. So they were, of course, invested in the building industry, but also state-owned industries like Hermann Göring works, for example. They were the huge players in the industry, and they were also really necessary because a lot of private industries didn't want to do the building projects that the dictatorship wanted to realize. And that's why it was so important that the Hermann Göring works started construction at the city of Salzgitter, or started in building the city of the Hermann Göring works, because a lot of private companies said that it wasn't worth to invest in that site in particular. So that's a really interesting part of the industry. The book on Adam Tooze really goes into detail and tries to figure out the numbers also, like what was invested on private side and on state side. But for our topic, although the construction companies are really important for our topic, of course, that would have just blown out our topic too much. But in this book, you can find definitely more details on that. So just a really general dive through this question, yeah.
The cooperation, the relationship between private enterprises and the state and the dictatorship was very diverse. For us, a very important example is that private enterprises demanded from the state, from the Nazi party, from the Wehrmacht, forced workers. If we have to do this, please give us 2,000 forced workers. And this was a very important reason for the Nazis to catch people and to obligate them to work for German enterprises, not only directly from the state. This is really a very amazing relationship.
Thank you. And thank you for staying up so late. I know it's bedtime in Germany.
Yeah. Yes, I think we can take a final question.
Well, I have a question.
You need to come in front, otherwise I need to hear you.
I also want to thank you for a wonderful lecture. The current federal administration of the United States is trying to use classes as an instrument to advance its latent authoritarian ways, but the architectural results are farcical, virtually idiotic when it comes to any kind of serious understanding or examination of architectural issues seen from an elite design perspective. How was it that in Germany, in such a short period of time, the level of competence in executing this work, both as projects and as built realities, how did that manage to happen so rapidly and so effectively? There's no doubt about the fact that much of what you showed us is hugely competent. The length of the freeway system, the time it took, the efficiency of the construction, in every way, in all aspects, how did that end up being such a marked dimension of the work of this regime?
One aspect to answer this is the fact that the German dictatorship, and it's not only the case of the German dictatorship, they can act without respecting, for instance, the property or the planning rights or the protection of monuments, and they can mobilize resources from the whole state and concentrate them. They are not obligated to explain, to justify such measures in front of the public opinion, and this is they don't have so many difficulties we have as planners in a democratic situation, that it's always very difficult to realize our projects, because it's we have to explain this, and we have to respect the law and the building culture, the memory, and so on. This is, I think, a fundamental difference, and this and architects and planners in that time, they used this, and they were very very happy to can realize what they wanted to do, and under democratic circumstances or under Weimar Republic, they couldn't do so.
Dann wir final question. Eine letzte Frage.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I was wondering, in your research, do you see Nazi urban planning as drawing on larger or longer traditions of imperial urbanism, particularly, say, Roman planning under Augustus or the Principate in general, in its use of monumentality and propaganda? Because I know that was a focus on your lecture, and I know you're working within a particular time frame, but just if that's something that you've developed further in your work, or you're interested in expanding on in the future.
So you mean the historical background of where the motives of monumentality came from and the ideals that they prepared in their plans?
Yes, exactly. I mean, because I know so much of the urban planning of Nazism was influenced by Rome, Imperial Rome, and also drawing upon that history. So the way that propaganda is related in that sense.
Well, of course, propaganda took that on, promoting Nazi urban planning as part of a great empire planning tradition and so on. So it's easy to fall for this narrative, but what we were focusing on was rather the relationship with the other dictatorships. So what influenced Nazi urban planning by Italy and Russia, or the Soviet Union, sorry, in particular during that period, but not like the historical motives that they already used. So it's more about what was actually happening at the time in different countries, and how these dictatorships were under competition also with each other. That's what we prepared over these 25 years, and by we I mean the other three, but not more about like the further background of all of this. And I don't think that there's so much to get from that narrative, probably. Yeah.
It is very important always to see that it's not one concept. There are many actors who say the Roman period is important. There are others, the Greek is much more important. The third, only the German tradition is. There's always a competition between all these concepts. There's never a really clear unified concept. This is very important. This is also that was interesting for us to see that is not that is also a strength a strength of a dictatorship to have this competition never ended. There's always competition, always, and this is also a reason. This was the other question for the effectiveness. Through this competition, some institutional ministries who didn't work, they lost an importance that other institutions were, other persons had. There's always a competition, and therefore it is also not clear what is an architectural style. There's never a clear direction that's our style, or there's always a a competition between different institutions, different persons, different narrative types, and it is changing in the years. So you must show in the initial years it is different to the situation, for example, in 1939. And you find this also, for example, in Italy. There's clearly also there is everything is changing, and it is very interesting to see that.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for this question. First of all, I'd like to thank Arlene for opening up this lecture slot for tonight's lecture, for allowing us to have you here. I want to thank our 4 guests and friends that they have taken the opportunity to talk about your work, to do this in English tonight, to stay up so late. And I want to thank the audience for your questions, your patience, your interest, but also finally maybe say I've learned a lot. A few things have become a lot more clear to me again, but of course I go on with a whole set of questions. And I think your evening tonight showed us how important it is for us to study these intense and very destructive phases in order for us to, in our own minds, be aware of what our profession is meant to do, what we are aiming for, and maybe also observe in this carefully laid out historical work that you did, that we might ourselves be experienced the crossing of red lines when our profession is drawn into destructive forces. And I think this is maybe a final word for tonight. I thank you so much also for taking the time in the middle of career fair, for bringing up the concentration and the interest. I wish especially our guests, but also our people in the audience, a very good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your attention. It was very